Hello and welcome to the programme which brings together some of the UK's leading columnists with the foreign correspondents who write, blog and broadcast from the Dateline London. Here in the studio with me are Steve Richards, who's been walking and reporting the Westminster beat for decades now, penning newspaper columns and presenting the podcast Rock and Roll Politics. Maria Margaronis is a journalist who's written and presented a number of radio documentaries, including on the crises, man-made and natural, which have afflicted Greece. Ashish Ray has half a century of explaining events here to his readers in India. A full-time occupation in itself, you might think, but he's still found time to commentate on his beloved cricket. Well, lovely to have you all in the studio with me and all together as well. So thank you very much for being with us. Now, Boris Johnson's street, at least according to a Ukrainian MP, could soon be found on maps for Odessa, as it expunges the memorialisation of famous Russians. Assuming the British Prime Minister's visit to India this week is followed in due course by a free trade deal, something neither the European Union nor the United States has pulled off, there'll probably be a thoroughfare named in his honour in Mumbai too. In this country, Boris Johnson Way... Sorry, let me say it again. In this country, Boris Johnson Way might be a cul-de-sac. Such is the growing contrast between Mr Johnson's global reputation and his domestic one. Despite championing the cause of Ukraine in Europe, there's been no finger-wagging in his meeting with Narendra Modi for the Indian Prime Minister's support for Russia. Modi, Johnson, Putin, populist leaders in the ascendant. By the end of this weekend, we'll know whether or not that holds true for France as well. Steve, let's begin with Boris Johnson at home. However much he would rather we weren't concentrating on that. What's changed this week and how potentially troublesome is that for Mr Johnson?
The mood of Conservative MPs. They are the ones with agency. Everyone else can express opinions about him. They are the ones with the power to remove him. And something moved on Thursday when the whips couldn't discipline them all to vote against what Labour was trying to do, which is to start an investigation fairly soon by one of the parliamentary select committees. And the reason why that's significant is that we always talk about what a Conservative MP is going to do, as if they were a collective, all of the same mind, all of similar experience. Actually, tons of them are pretty new to national politics, having got in December 2019. So quite a lot of the time when people say, oh, Conservative MPs are going to do this, they don't know. They aren't quite sure what to do. And they're still in that kind of mood. But when you have kind of made something of a move to signal distance with the Prime Minister, that empowers you to do it again. So that's one of the things that's changed. And the other is, it just feels as if this crisis for him is just not going to end. There's a corrosive quality to it. It's always been deadly serious to face an allegation of making rules, breaking them, and then lying about doing so. But there was a sense sometimes that it was going to fade, but it hasn't. So the combination of these two, I think, are quite significant.
Maria, I was very struck on Friday listening to Lord Hayward, a former Conservative MP who's been around since the 1980s, who was recalling the mood change when he was a young MP for Margaret Thatcher in that last year before she ceased to be Prime Minister. But he also said something really interesting. He said that last weekend, Easter weekend as it was, in much of the country, much of the continent, he said he was reflecting the Prime Minister was probably all right for now. And his mood had changed in the space of less than a week because he'd been talking to Conservative MPs. What do you think is the problem here for Boris Johnson? Is it just that it keeps coming back at it?
People are just fed up with this. I mean, I'm fed up with it. We're all fed up with it. I don't want to talk about this anymore. But the thing that puzzles me is, this is a man who's been known to lie all his life. I think it was either his headmaster or his housemaster at Eton who wrote, Boris doesn't seem to think the rules apply to him. Look at the Brexit campaign, look at the thing, there's going to be no border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. It's endless. The lies are endless, and look at what happened.
But they haven't mattered, apparently.
Well, and look at the policy problems. Look at what happened here during the pandemic. Underneath the lies is a great mountain of incompetence and bad administration and bad government. Now, I see why lying particularly matters at the moment, when we have so many lies in international politics, when we have, Putin's lies about what's going on in Ukraine.
It's not an invasion, we're acting to defend ourselves.
All of that. So, yes, lies matter, lies to the House of Commons matter, breaking your own rules matter, but to me, it's like this is the sort of cherry on the cake of a lot else that's gone very badly wrong.
Actually, so how was he received in India? Because this visit had been delayed because of COVID, but there had been a sense that it was one that the Indian government was keen on, just as arguably the British government was, and that perhaps he was a more attractive figure to many in India, and certainly to the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, than his predecessor Theresa May, who went to India, but whose visit was a bit of a flop, really.
Well, over the years, Boris has been a popular figure in India. His dishevelled hair and his jokes tended to go down well. So to that extent, I think he is not an unpopular figure in India. They don't care much about what's going on in this country. So he was well received. But unfortunately for him, if the timing of the visit was meant to divert attention from what was going on in Westminster, it has failed spectacularly. And certainly the coverage that has come out in the last 2 days have overshadowed his claims about trade and defense and the rest of it. Certainly on day one, it was completely about the debate at Westminster.
Which was taking place that day on his first visit to India.
Correct. Yeah. And also the fact that the motion was passed and he's been now referred to the Privileges Committee, it's really bad news. But in India, I think the little saving grace that he might have had on day 2, I think that too was dogged by questions regarding what was going on back home. And as much as he tried to deflect it by talking about other things and the brighter side and so on, but I think at the end of the day, this tended to be the questions which were put to him at the press conference, for instance.
Steve, we're at a strange stage. The police have said there will be no further announcements about fines over lockdown parties before the local elections. So they've gone into their own version of purdah, if you like, so they don't want to be accused of influencing the outcome of those elections. Those elections are now, less than 2 weeks away. Come the Friday after polling day, what will be the kind of calculation you think the Conservative MPs may be making?
Well, 2 things. Before then, I've spoken to some who have said that although they have big doubts about him, there is no way they're going to speak during this campaign because all their local party activists are out campaigning and they don't want to have quotes plastered over Labour posters about their views of Boris Johnson. So we are at a sort of strange phase, although some I notice are speaking out already and surprisingly loudly that he has to go. If the elections go really badly for the Conservatives, normally a Prime Minister can brush that off as mid-term results, plenty to recover by the time of the general election. But because of this context, it will be explosive, and there's quite a pivotal by-election coming up later on in the summer. So there are these electoral tests, but I think in a way it's almost got beyond that. When you say, why is it carrying on? It's the nature of the allegation. It might have been around since December, but it is, you can't get a bigger allegation. Now, he's always insisted he didn't think they were parties and all the rest of it. But the police seem to be taking a different view, given the number of penalty notices that have gone out. There's this independent grey, not independent, actually, commissioned by Boris Johnson, grey report to come. And I think that is his problem, the nature of what he is alleged to have done during these lockdowns. And that's the problem with voters as well, who've turned.
Isn't it really about about arrogance, about people's realization of the arrogance of this Prime Minister, people whose relatives died, who couldn't be with their relatives, who couldn't go to see their dying mother and father. I mean, everyone who lost someone in the pandemic and who kept the rules is just disgusted by this.
Yeah, I don't think arrogance is the right word to describe him in a curious way. There's a thoughtlessness. You know, most prime ministers are neurotic about every move they make. If I do this, what will happen? He doesn't tend to pose those questions. So, you know, a Theresa May or a Gordon Brown having drinks at a work do, they'll be agonised. You know, is this a party? Is it a work do? Could it be seen as a party? I don't think he goes through those thought processes and reflect on consequences. Well, good question. Yeah, good question.
Interestingly, what I would say is that he was certainly in trouble in February, and then came the Russian invasion, and that seemed to give him a little bit of a lease of life. And you constantly heard conservative politicians saying that this is not the time to oust him. But what has happened in the last week, I think, is a change of mood. I entirely agree with what Steve has said.
And of course, that argument, don't oust him in the middle of the war, doesn't really stack up historically. Lloyd George replaced Asquith in the middle of the First World War. Churchill replaced Chamberlain during the Second World War. Right. And Margaret Thatcher was replaced during the First Gulf War by John Major. Just, Ashish, let's talk a bit about the Ukraine and in particular Narendra Modi's relationship with Vladimir Putin. First of all, how important is that relationship strategically for India? I mean, I understand that there's historical association, you know, the non-aligned movement and, you know, poking the United States in the eye, which was a very popular thing to do back in the 50s and the 60s. But now?
Well, first of all, India hasn't supported Russia on this invasion. So India has been neutral. The interesting thing is that Modi has done a sort of half somersault, if you like, for the simple reason that Indian foreign policy from 1991 onwards was multi-alignment, because the Cold War had ended and India reached out to the West and the West responded, so it became multi-alignment. But what Modi did was, when he came to power, he certainly tilted towards the United States. So from that position, I think it became a little awkward, for the simple reason that people in the West started asking, but then, you know, we thought that you were with us now. But India has this disadvantage, if you like, of dependence on Russia in terms of defense. 50% of India's defense imports come from Russia. And then over the years, when it's come to tricky situations for India at international forums, at the United Nations, at the UN Security Council, Russia has always saved India.
And that's a very interesting perspective on that relationship, isn't it, Maria? So Prime Minister Modi makes this announcement in an interview, or at least he says, I want an immediate ceasefire, which is perceived at least as a slight toughening of the position, given that they've had this position of neutrality on the invasion. That kind of took a bit of pressure, I guess, off Boris Johnson, because people were saying, shouldn't you have been out there, maybe not wagging finger publicly, but quietly pressing behind the scenes and saying, come on, we really need you to use your influence on the Russians?
I imagine that one of the things Boris Johnson has been saying, and as part of this trumpeted trade deal, is that he should be buying arms from Britain instead of from India, because Britain has, you know, a very large arms industry. So that's part of it. I wonder how much Modi has been kind of, you know, getting a boost from Boris's arrival. I saw those big posters up on the street saying, welcome Boris Johnson. And, you know, there's all sorts of problems at home in India. And the fact, you know, the other issue for Boris Johnson was, is he going to say anything about the BJP and the Muslim community? Is he going to speak about that at all?
We talked last time you were on about the persecution of Christians as well as it.
Yes. But I think he said nothing.
No.
There is a reference where Boris, I think, said that India has constitutional safeguards on these matters, because he was asked a question at the press conference. By the way, Modi doesn't do press conferences.
So this is really unusual.
Yes, so they had the sort of two statements being made by the two leaders. They walked away, and then separately, from what I could make out, perhaps at the residence of the British High Commissioner, Boris held a press conference where he took questions. So yes, he did say that India has safeguards, but that's a very soft thing to say, given the current circumstances.
Let me ask you, I'm interested in terms of what you were saying about weapons, well, you were both saying about weapons, actually, and this question of, OK, we've got a big arms business in the UK. Boris Johnson, part of any Prime Minister's foreign travels is promotion of business interests on the behalf of their country. We have this tie-up now with Australia and the United States, AUKUS. We already have India as part of the Quad with the United States and again with other countries in that region. Is it possible that India would be interested in this new alignment with the Australians, with the British, with the Americans?
I think AUKUS is a bit awkward for Quad.
Right.
Because
Yes.
India is not part of AUKUS.
Indeed, but it is part of Quad, yeah.
Yes, it's a competitor. But there is scope of British exports, defence exports to India. There has been a steady stream, but not very significant in recent years. Britain lost out majorly on the combat aircraft deal, which went to the French.
Yes.
But that is now mired in a little bit of controversy for the simple reason that it's alleged that the Modi government paid possibly 3 times more than what was estimated by the Indian Defence Ministry. And so it's a matter of investigation by a prosecutor in Paris at the moment. So the charge is obviously
Yes.
Corruption.
Yes.
That said, I think Britain is a competitor when it comes to aircraft and other products, certainly. And I would venture to say that this visit and subsequently will lead to some enhanced British exports to India.
Right. We're talking about weapons. Let's talk about weapons to Ukraine. And the Prime Minister announced British tanks are going to Poland so that Poland can, to replace the tanks that Poland will send to Ukraine, because obviously Ukraine has the engineering knowledge and the spare parts, bluntly, for Soviet-era equipment, not Western equipment. He also suggested there could come a point where we send Challenger tanks directly to Ukraine. I mean, is that upping the ante, or has this become such a blurred question that it doesn't actually have any clear significance?
Oh no, it does, and I don't think it is blurred. And I think it is very interesting when you look at the origins of many terrible global wars, like World War I and World War II, especially World War I. You could see everyone moving in different directions with no intention of it becoming a global nightmare. And it becomes one. And when this all began, people said, Biden and others, Johnson, we've got to be very careful about escalation. And there you have an example of something which appears to be an escalation in terms of the UK's involvement. And I heard a Tory MP being interviewed this morning saying, what is the end? Johnson said Putin must lose. What does that mean?
Yes. What does losing look like?
What does losing look like? And that is related to the question of whether, the UK and others should continue supplying all kinds of equipment to Ukraine, because what is the end? And I think that question is starting to be posed and has to be answered, or else it just stealthily becomes some potentially terrible conflagration. I mean, it's already awful, obviously.
Yeah, of course.
But what is the end game? And it's not at all clear.
No, I think Johnson's rode back a little bit today
Oh,
and
has
said
he?
that this is now under consideration.
Okay. Not that it's definitely going to happen.
No, but this is, I mean, he's thinking of doing what Biden decided not to do with aircraft, but with tanks. And I do know that there are Ukrainian troops being trained to use tanks here now. To me, it's not a clear line. Where does this become a wider war, and who makes it so? I mean, Putin's just testing a new ICBM. It's really difficult. I completely take your point about people making moves and not knowing where they go. And it seems now, just on the ground, that Russia is very close to joining up the Crimea with the Donbass. Then we have on the other side Transnistria in Moldavia, and in between Odessa, that kind of quintessential historic cosmopolitan city. Which is, I mean, that would be a huge deal if Odessa fell to the Russians.
Let's talk in the last few minutes about, I mean, one of the things that kind of unites Narendra Modi, Vladimir Putin and Boris Johnson is that we perceive them as populists, as people who've ridden a wave of particular strong public feeling and have been able to guide it and have benefited from it, have ridden that wave quite successfully, the three of them thus far, in different ways, enforced in different ways. There is an election this weekend that could see a fourth joining that group, and it's the French presidential election where Emmanuel Macron, the kind of quintessential centrist, is challenged by Marine Le Pen, the kind of forever candidate of the far right. Certainly seems to be forever when you think of her father as well. All right, people have said she's not going to win, but they haven't completely written her off.
No, and I think part of the problem in France is that Macron is not seen by most people as a centrist, but seen as being on the right. So it's a choice between two right-wing candidates. You have Mélenchon's voters on the left, many of them feeling...
And he really is a perennial candidate. I mean, he's endlessly a candidate of the left, but he has that familiarity.
Many people saying that they just can't bear to hold their nose and vote for Macron. It reminds me a little bit of the Trump-Hillary Clinton election, that kind of the perception of smugness, of, candidate for the rich, of the establishment, all of that. But again, the polls suggest that she won't win, but the underlying issues are not going away, which have produced this wave of populists.
And to be fair, a lot of these issues were there 5 years ago.
They were.
You can understand perhaps some of the public feeling that where has President Macron been on these things?
Well, exactly, but a lot of these things are insoluble by national governments. I mean, they are to do with globalization. They are to do with these enormous issues about energy, climate, migration, that are very threatening to people.
I think one of the problems in this climate of an anti-Russia environment has been the fact that her party took this loan from a Russian bank. Of course, it was taken out 6 years ago.
Yes.
But the fact is that it's still the party with the national rally is still paying back the loan, and it comes at a bad time for her. And as you know, in the debate, Macron raised this matter. But having said that, I think at the end of the day, I think the fear of the far right will prevail. And therefore, regardless of Macron's average performance, I think people will reconcile themselves to re-electing him.
It's a very curious voting system, isn't it? In that in the first round, virtually every voter has a kind of voice and can identify, and that you get this incredible range.
Yes.
The left did better than expected and so on. And then it's narrowed down and people have to agonize over what to do. I'm sure you will probably be proven right, because that's the essence of that system, isn't it? People in the end...
It was supposed to drive people to a clear choice.
A clear choice, and the least worst, so to speak. But I'm just so used to shock results now. I kind of would be surprised if there isn't a shock result.
I mean, we were sitting here before. I mean, I think it's fair to say we were sitting here, not naming individuals, because I'm not sure if any of you were on the panel that week, but the week before Donald Trump was elected, or maybe a couple of weeks before, people were still pretty confident that he wasn't going to pull it off. Yeah.
And even on election night, I remember the broadcasters were still early on reporting as if Hillary Clinton had won, even though some of the results were suggesting that was not going to happen. We are so conditioned to expect one thing, but as I say, I think we're now increasingly conditioned to be shocked.
Two factors. One is a large number of undecided voters, and you don't know which way they'll end up on the final day. The second is this very significant Mélenchon section of voters.
Yes, Agnès Poirier was telling us last week.
Attracted 21% in the first round.
But also, it attracted something like 3/4 of all Muslim voters. Now, if those Muslim French voters can be persuaded that Macron is at least more tolerable for their prospects than Le Pen, and that you can mobilise that vote, then that could be significant. But if that vote sits on its hands...
But 50% of them might. I don't say it will happen, but one poll said that 50% of them might either not vote or spoil their ballot.
Yes.
I think he was in Saint-Denis today, which is a very heavily Muslim banlieue suburb of Paris, and he's on it. He's on it.
But a long way into his presidency,
a long way to go.
Yes,
it is,
I know he's not been known in the banlieue very often.
No, he has not.
The question is the future, isn't it? It's kind of the nature of our beast, where we look at we review the week, but also we look ahead. And notwithstanding the result on Sunday night, it's a question of what happens next time round, isn't it? Because there will be no Emmanuel Macron. He can't run for a third successive term, even if he could come back 5 years after that. And there's no, will that party have a candidate? Will there be a return to the left and right? Marine Le Pen could still be a candidate in 5 years' time.
Absolutely, she
Yeah,
could.
she's been around forever and will continue to remain forever a candidate. But this is the other thing, because the collapse of the so-called orthodox parties in France and the rise of Macron almost as a sort of personalised party has kind of completely fractured the party system. And yet, although it is a presidential election that we're witnessing now, you do have to have party bases. You know, Macron busted through that, but with these consequences that the parties are so weakened, there could be space for a Le Pen figure to sort of surface at some point. So I think it's rather worrying that those older parties have just kind of collapsed, because what replaces them?
Yeah, the party may be over for some, but the consequences live on for everybody else. And Maria Margaronis, Ashish Ray and Steve Richards, thank you all very much. Thank you very much for your company. Martin Croxall will be in this chair next week. I'll see you in a fortnight's time. From all at Dateline, goodbye.